Welcome back to the Indian Society of Toxicology's YouTube channel. In this episode, we will be discussing a very important and fascinating aspect of toxicology, and that is the use, or I would rather say the misuse, of poison as a murder weapon. This comes under the realm of forensic toxicology actually, and it is a pretty vast subject, homicidal poisoning. So we can have two parts with regard to discussion. The first part being preliminary aspects, and the second part we will go into intricacies with some case histories. So we will look at, in this part 1 of the episode on poison as a murder weapon, some basic kinds of information. There are some confusing terminologies that we need to address first before we go into the intricacies of the topic in this episode. For instance, a lot of terms are used for substances that can cause toxic effects on the human body. Terms like poison, chemical, drug, toxicant, toxin. Often these terms are used synonymously, and yet there are actually subtle differences. For instance, poison is a very broad term that covers any substance that can cause toxic effects, whereas a chemical is a substance of chemical origin, whereas a toxin is of organic origin derived from plant or animal, and a drug is something with basically medicinal properties that can cause deleterious effects in overdose or misuse, and toxicant is something like a poison. But since these terms are often used interchangeably and can cause a lot of confusion, there is a move among toxicologists to have a common term to cover all these kinds of substances, and that is xenobiotic. Xenobiotic is what is being increasingly used to refer to any substance that can cause toxic effects. Unfortunately, it has not yet caught on widely, and so we will, for the purpose of this discussion, go back to the conventional term, and that is poison. Now, before we go to the homicidal aspects of poisoning, we need to understand what the term poison itself means, isn't it? Now, you can very well answer that with another question, that is, what is not a poison? Because after all, several centuries ago, in 16th century to be precise, the Swiss alchemist Paracelsus famously said, "There is no such thing as a non-poison. Every substance is a poison. It just depends on the dose and mode of administration." So even food items can be poison. If, for instance, you eat in excess or the food is spoiled, and even water can be a poison. There is something called water intoxication. You drink too much water, you can get sick. So, really speaking, there is no such thing as a non-poison. But then this kind of definition is not going to work when you have to give a formal, kind of explanation of the term. So here it is, the standard definition for poison. I have broken this down so that it is easy to comprehend and recall. A poison is any substance which, when introduced into the living body or brought into contact with any part thereof, will produce ill effects or death by its local or systemic action or both. I think that is a fairly easy kind of definition to remember, and it is something that takes into account I think, all aspects of what is meant by a poison. So, this is the definition that one must give when asked as to what exactly is meant by the term poison. Then there is this confusing terminology with regard to types of poisoning. You have terms like fulminant poisoning, acute, chronic, subacute poisoning. So it is laid out on this slide that you see for easy recall and to tell you what exactly each type of poisoning means. Like, for instance, fulminant poisoning. It means that the person concerned has taken a massive dose or exposed a massive dose of poison, and there is usually collapse with rapid death, especially if the poison is quite potent or powerful. Then there's something called acute poisoning, where a single large dose has been taken, though not a massive dose, or several small doses have been taken in a short period of time. There is usually abrupt onset. Then you have chronic poisoning, where small doses have been taken over a long period of time, or the person has been exposed to small doses of the poison over a prolonged period, and there is usually a gradual insidious onset with relentless progression. That is chronic poisoning. And subacute poisoning is something that has features of both acute and chronic poisoning. So these are some of the terms that can confuse a person in regard to toxicology. So I thought we'll deal with that first before we move on to the topic for this episode, and that is in forensic toxicology, we are dealing with one particular aspect, that is homicidal poisoning. Now, if you look at this slide, forensic toxicology is a branch of toxicology that deals with the criminal use of poisons and the investigation and detection of such criminal use. Very clear that it deals mainly with medico-legal aspects of toxicology. So you have topics under forensic toxicology like poisoning death, which may be accidental, suicidal, or homicidal. Then there is this emerging topic that is chemical terrorism, which is gaining in importance because of some incidents that have occurred in relation to this in the recent past. Then you have stupefaction, date rape, vitriolage or acid throwing, and of course substance abuse or drug abuse. These are the important components of forensic toxicology. But we are here in this particular episode to discuss mainly homicidal poisoning, and that too as to why poisoning is an ideal way of committing murder. Why is it that we should really be concerned about the use of a poison as a means of committing murder? Whether one knows about this or not, it is true that most perfect murders in history have involved the use of poisons. Actually, that is not entirely right to phrase it like that, because if it is a perfect murder, then naturally the fact that it was a murder would not be known at all. Because when you say perfect, it means the person has got away with it. That is why I put that term under inverted commas here. But it is true that many a time near perfect murders have involved the use of poisons, and we have to assume that there are several murders which were committed with the help of poisons, and the incident was never realized or known, and the perpetrator got away scot-free. In other words, perfect murders. We do not know as to how many such perfect murders have been committed, and the person who did it escaped justice. Now, we will see as to why poisoning is an ideal way of committing murder. There are several reasons. The first reason is some of the most potent poisons can be procured without difficulty. I don't think anybody will have any problem with understanding this. If you look at the images on the slide itself, it will give you a very clear idea that some of the commonest deadly poisons are easily available, easily accessible. You don't even have to purchase some of them. They are, for instance, in the form of plant toxins. You may be able to pluck the fruit or the seeds of a very poisonous plant and use that. Like, for instance, castor, which is shown here, small, spiny capsules containing seeds. The seeds are very potent because they contain a highly powerful toxin called ricin. And though castor oil itself is relatively harmless, the press cake which is left behind after extraction of the oil can be deadly, as well as the seeds when they are chewed and swallowed, or they have been powdered and swallowed, or even extract has been injected. Very powerful toxin indeed. Then there is an image of datura capsule, which is a slightly bigger kind of fruit capsule, also spiny, and there are datura seeds inside, which can also be quite deadly and can cause serious poisoning and even fatality. There are also images of some other poisons, like for instance arsenic, which is not really all that difficult to get. It's a heavy metal with a notorious reputation. And then you have a variety of insecticides, one of which is shown here, chlorpyrifos, which is a powerful organophosphorus insecticide, extremely deadly if exposed to this compound, whether accidental or deliberate. And then you have a variety of medicinal preparations, like for instance morphine, which is an opiate. And though morphine itself is a little difficult to obtain, you'll have to be a medical professional perhaps to get access to such a drug. But there are so many other drugs, some of them sold over the counter, which can be almost as deadly. So it is a fact that some of the most potent poisons can be procured without difficulty, and that is a very alarming fact indeed. Number 2, some poisons cause death in a manner that does not raise suspicion, probably because the signs and symptoms which evolve may resemble a natural disease. Like for instance, if you use digoxin in a person who does not have a heart ailment, it can induce heart problems, and the person may manifest in such a way that somebody else may think he's having a natural ailment related to the heart. Digoxin, as you all know, is useful in various kinds of heart disease, but that's a different kind of situation. If you use digoxin in a healthy person without any cardiac problem, even therapeutic dose, so-called therapeutic dose of digoxin, can be very dangerous and sometimes fatal. And in those with the heart disease also, if you use it in excess, it can cause serious problems. Then you have preparations like insulin used for diabetes. If a person, takes insulin and he has diabetes, it is all right. It's a kind of therapeutic intervention which is indicated. But if he takes overdose, or if a person who is not having diabetes takes insulin, it can cause serious problems and death. And the manifestations may be such that nobody may suspect poisoning. So this is the second reason why poisoning can be an ideal way of committing murder. That is, the event itself may not raise any suspicion at all, and the person may get away with murder. Number 3, it is a fact that there is low awareness about poisons among law enforcement officers and even doctors, because toxicology is a subject that unfortunately has not been given the kind of importance that should have been given in police training and in training of doctors. There are now steps being taken to address this long-standing negligence, but the fact remains that as of today, there is not much of awareness, unfortunately, about poisons and poisoning among police officers, doctors, and so on. And that is a big advantage to somebody who would like to use poison as a means of committing homicide or some form of harm to somebody else. Number 4, false notions about poisons and poisoning. There's a lot of misinformation about poisons and also poisoning. Much of it is to do with ignorance. And people go by what is, projected as truth by people who actually do not know much about toxicology. And that is again a sad fact. Today in the digital era, this fact has been compounded instead of being ameliorated. And a lot of information exists out there in the internet which may be misleading or erroneous or fallacious. And sometimes you do not know which is right and which is wrong. And that is why there are so many kinds of myths and false notions that can interfere with a proper investigation of a case of poisoning. Number 5, difficulty in establishing cause of death in a case of poisoning. This is perhaps the most troublesome. Even if an autopsy is done, once suspicion has been raised that a particular death is to do with poisoning, there may not be significant autopsy findings to indicate that it is a case of poisoning, or for that matter, to substantiate a suspicion that a particular poison is involved. That's because many a time poisoning does not leave behind very characteristic features. There are, of course, some poisons which have typical features, but there are many other poisons which do not leave behind any specific signs, only maybe non-specific signs may be present that cannot be taken to mean that it is definitely a case of poisoning or that so-and-so poison was responsible for the death. So even a meticulous autopsy sometimes fails to establish cause of death as related to poisoning, which is again a very disturbing fact indeed. And then there is this widespread notion that almost any kind of poison can be detected in the human body with the help of chemical analysis. And today, of course, there are several methods, several kinds of equipment available for analyzing body fluids and tissues for poisons or injurious chemicals. But the fact remains that some poisons exist which can escape detection even by the most sophisticated methods of analysis. So chemical analysis is also not something that is foolproof, and even if a doctor suspects a case of poisoning in a patient and submits the relevant body fluids or tissues for examination, still it may be possible that the result may come as negative, even though it's actually a case of poisoning. So these are some of the reasons why poisons are, almost ideal as homicidal. And there's a lot of information out there. I'm sure many people know about the notorious reputation of these chemicals as homicidal poisons. And then there are drugs also like opiates, also called narcotics, sedatives, and plant toxins like strychnine, datura, oleander. These are all poisons which have been employed quite commonly in various situations, various locations, and many a time we know about these poisons. But then there are rarely used homicidal poisons which are equally deadly. And this may not be easily apparent to people. Like, for instance, chemicals like thallium, which is a heavy metal that is pretty near, I think, the perfect homicidal poison because of a lot of advantages. We'll discuss that in detail in another episode. And gas like carbon monoxide also pretty powerful and almost, as perfect a homicidal agent as thallium. These are chemicals which are not widely known in the realm of homicidal poisoning. So also drugs like tubercularine, succinylcholine, insulin, various cardiovascular drugs, and plant toxins like aconite, castor, digitalis. The common man may not associate some of these chemicals or toxins with the potential to be used as homicidal agent. Finally, we have unusual homicidal poisons where you hardly ever think of these substances or chemicals in a homicidal situation, and yet they have been employed in murders in the past. Pesticides, for instance, there are some very powerful pesticides indeed, like for instance, organophosphorus compounds, which are very easily available and easily, accessible to the common man. And they have been employed in murder quite successfully in the past and continue to be used. So also the case of alcohol, which may be laced with something that is mixed with something, and a person who drinks such alcohol may not realize that he is consuming something that is contaminated or deliberately adulterated. And there have been cases reported of homicidal poisoning being accomplished with the help of such laced alcohol. An very unusual kind of homicidal poison involves the use of snake venom. Sometimes the snake itself is used as a murder weapon. There is a sensational case which is being investigated right now in Kerala, where a man killed his wife by having a venomous snake bite her. And that is again something that can escape detection, because often we don't think of snake venom or snake bite as a homicidal agent. And these are things that we need to really understand, that there are a number of poisons out there. Some of them we don't associate with criminal use, and yet they are being employed by people with that kind of bent of mind. And what about infective agents? Microbial toxins. There are very powerful toxins out there which can cause illnesses that resemble natural disease, natural occurrence, and yet may be deliberately employed by somebody in order to cause harm or even to kill a person. So we will wind up by looking at some important points with regard to chemical analysis as to why chemical analysis may not succeed all the time. Because there is this widespread notion that if somebody has a suspicion of poisoning, that somebody is being poisoned or somebody has died as a result of poisoning, we can find out for sure by submitting the relevant body fluids or tissues for analysis. That is not really all that correct, because there are many reasons why chemical analysis may fail, like the reasons listed here. Number one, not all poisons can be detected by chemical analysis. I've already touched upon this. Then there is this point, not all results can be correctly interpreted. Toxicology report can be sometimes very difficult to understand and interpret. It is not like other investigative reports, for instance pathology or biochemistry, which are pretty straightforward. Toxicology reporting and understanding such a report can be misleading if one is not careful, because as I said, the interpretation may be tricky. Then there is this point where a case of poisoning, death has occurred, and viscera have been submitted for analysis, but unfortunately it's not the right kind of viscera. The viscera where the poison is concentrated has not been selected. Some other kind of viscera have been sent for analysis, and that can also vitiate the results. Then there is this inappropriate preservation. Even if a doctor has collected the right kind of viscera but has not preserved them properly and sent them to the laboratory, they can deteriorate, and that can also vitiate analysis. Of course, delay in performing analysis can also be a problem, and you may not get the desired result. And then the laboratory itself may not have suitable equipment, and even if that is present, maybe there is a lack of qualified staff, which can all affect the performance of analysis and interpretation. So chemical analysis, while it is useful in many cases, is not always useful. So we come to the end of part 1 of this particular topic, that is poison as a murder weapon, where we looked at some of the preliminary aspects, and we will go into the intricacies and some case histories also we'll look at in the next part next time. Till then, this is goodbye from me on behalf of the Indian Society of Toxicology, and we will meet again in part 2 of this very interesting and important topic in toxicology. Bye-bye.